they are, on the one hand, designed to make us feel more connected to each other. And that's sort of like the idea that they're selling to us. And yet they seem to result in us all feeling more and more alienated.
This is Champagne is Also a Band podcast. One songwriter, one song. I'm Sven, your host for a journey into the music of Champaign-Urbana. Recorded in the Blue Box studio with a songwriter from the Champaign-Urbana music scene, past or present. Champagne is Also a Band podcast is proud to be a part of the Champagne Showers Podcast Network. Welcome to Champagne is Also a Band podcast. In today's bonus episode, I'm chatting with Michael Thies from episode 122. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about your Metaphysics album, Duality, which you released September 27th of 2024.
Right on.
Without further ado, let's talk about this album.
Maybe I should say this up front. There was a part of me that was worried that I would never finish this album. And coming on the podcast previously, there was a part of me that was thinking, if I mention that this is something I'm working on and that I intend for the song we talked about last time, that I intend for it to just be a part of this upcoming album, if I put it out there publicly, then I have to actually do it.
Right.
So coming back here now feels like a very appropriate kind of full circle moment where I get to kind of like close the loop and just let everybody know, hey, I did it.
Just previously, you mentioned that when we talked originally on your episode that you were in the process of writing this album. One of the things that is apparent is that the song that we talked about in episode 122, 6 to Midnight, is track number 5 on this. And I was curious, at the time, did you have other songs written, or was this the first song of the album that you wrote?
I think the way I tend to kind of work on music is a lot of different ideas will just be kind of percolating together at the same time. It's really hard to kind of put my finger on, this was done at this point in time and this one was done before or after. I do kind of make a point every time I open a new project, session file, I'll just date it with the date that it started. So I'm able to kind of retroactively look back and see where ideas started, but I don't necessarily have as good of a handle on when they're considered done. A lot of these songs were finished around the same time. I mean, that was kind of like when I know that, I have, let's call it an album. Like when I've got like enough ideas that all kind of seem to fit together, that then it's like, okay, now I can actually know what I'm working towards.
At a certain point, did you see this album having a particular trajectory or story or narrative? I'm always curious about, did you write with the intention of a certain idea, or did a certain idea start to emerge as you were working on these songs?
It did change over time. I was initially thinking Metaphysics as a project initially started by definition almost like on the internet, trading tracks back and forth with people, just like recording ideas, bringing friends in, to sing different parts, or trade production ideas back and forth. And I wanted to kind of almost return to that. However, the more I worked on it, the more appropriate it felt that it was going to end up just kind of being me alone. And I think conceptually that was in part because the subject matter that I kept returning to, which is really not an original idea at all. It seems like everyone's talking about it these days, but just sort of the alienation of the internet and algorithmic driven consumption models that force us into our own little echo chambers, and the corporate interests that profit off of that, and how alienating that is to an individual. I just kept returning to this subject, and over time realized this actually is more an album about somebody reckoning with all of that on their own, because I think that we're all sort of forced to.
I'm also kind of fascinated with the one word of duality, because duality just means two things, but often it is presented in almost a yin and yang sort of way, where it's the opposite side of the same coin, or it's the dark to the light, or it's, something where they're kind of polar opposites. And in much the same way as that you just mentioned, the idea of alienation happening within what is considered a social media. Social, you're supposed to be interconnecting, communicating, working with one another. Alienation is not working with other people, not interacting with other people, kind of living in your own world, right?
Yeah.
And I also think about the idea of how AI is creeping in. Mm-hmm. And even when you think that you're talking to, not that you would think that you're talking, but I mean, when something is a status or a post or whatever is showing up in your feed, it could be that it's just some thing that is generating based upon your likes and basically your algorithm, which in a sense is like making you just be a monolith in a way. It's basically bouncing back. That's the whole definition of an echo chamber, right?
Sure.
But I was just thinking of this one thing, this monolith of being a person screaming and waiting for the echo to come back. I was kind of curious, since we talked about 6 to Midnight, how you worked 6 to Midnight into the narrative of this overall idea of duality.
I think you hit on something that also kind of kept coming up again and again throughout this collection of songs, which is the duality, as in, like, we all have these conflicts within us on a personal level, but then also we're all part of a overarching system, and the ways in which we as individuals have to navigate how we choose to interact with the systems that are in place in our society. In a sense, I think that reveals itself, as you were saying, in the context of the internet. You're an individual choosing to engage with these platforms, these social media platforms, and they are, on the one hand, designed to make us feel more connected to each other, and that's sort of like the idea that they're selling to us, and yet they seem to result in us all feeling more and more alienated.
Within that context, the album starts off with the track Never Offline. And I was going to try to make sure I said that exactly right, because I feel like its companion piece is the Always Online.
Yeah.
I wish that I had a little bit more time, because I felt like those might have been written pretty close to one another. I'm kind of curious about how those two brother and sister songs came out in this album, like when you were writing, how they relate to one another.
I definitely intentionally positioned them on the album to kind of have a discourse with each other. Obviously, an album that's centered around the idea of duality, you'll have opposites. But as we're navigating all these things that, again, have to do with the way we're sort of trapped within our own algorithms and dealing with the duality that we're all forced to navigate these systems again. And yet the choices we make, we're still always kind of trapped within the system. So in particular, it can just be something as basic as Elon Musk buys Twitter. I take issue with a lot of the ways he's chosen to run that platform. And it's how do you combat some of that? Well, at the end of the day, if your main platform for amplifying your own voice happens to be Twitter, then you're stuck on the same platform that he owns to communicate about how frustrated you are about things that he might be doing. It's that we're never offline, we're always online. It's just a way of kind of getting at this idea that there's a certain contradiction in that, I'm posting this internet about the internet on the internet. There's always going to be this sort of meta narrative at play. And it was just a way of kind of you would expect in an album about duality to be okay, well, you're never offline. And then the sort of opposite of that would be throw your phone in the trash and and like get away from it all. But in some sense, it's just sort of a way of saying like, well, maybe we shouldn't retreat from the conversation because we need to actually have positive voices in those spaces, despite how frustrating of a process that might be.
That whole, I hate capitalism, but I live in a capitalist society, so I have to function within those parameters, right? So totally. You're like, I'm stuck no matter what I do. How do I function? I would love to cut myself off completely from social media because hate to use this, but it's a rigged system. I'm overwhelmed by the fact that sometimes I will say something positive, kind of throw those out into the internets, as the kids like to say, right, and it just disappears. But if I say something particularly negative or something slightly inflammatory, that gets seen. And in some ways, it just it like adds blood to the water. In some ways, I think about, because you're encouraging language that is more antagonistic.
Yeah,
and by pushing that, you're creating a culture where that antagonism is standard. It feels gross sometimes, and whatever. Sometimes I just think I'm just like throwing stuff out into the void, and I'm like, it's just gonna have to be good, not that the actual content, but I'm just like, I have to not think about how that's going to be, picked up or boosted or whatever. It's just, I'm just throwing that out there. If somebody happens to see it, they'll see it, and that's good.
That issue in particular gets brought up probably at several points on the album, but one in particular is the song Gridlocked, which I think we talked about this before. I'm pretty cagey about lyrics because I don't really consider myself a lyricist, and a lot of times I kind of write in this like cut and paste style where I run out of syllables and then like basically just kind of chop things off where they end in the phrase. But the refrain in that song is something along the lines of like, I was trying to say fighting fire with fire is only going to burn everything down. Something along those lines. And I think the way it ended up coming out in the song is just like fighting fire with fire only brings more. Something like that. And I was just thinking about the idea that like, the social media model, obviously, again, this is like old news, but that it is programmed to essentially profit off of our inability to communicate with each other. and that's so ironic and so counterintuitive for something that was supposed to bring us together.
That's funny because I think your musical aesthetic is driven by the accompaniment, and yet the vocals function as kind of another instrument that buries itself a little bit. I was thinking about even that in the message of getting buried in the algorithms too, where it's just like, I may have something really, really important to say, but it just gets buried and then is hidden from the world. Like, unless somebody goes to my page or goes to look at that feed specifically, they may not see it at all. And I think about like shadow banning, you know, in Twitter, that's like, you can see that it looks like you posted it, but no one is seeing it. I was thinking about how when you bury your words in the music, it's almost like that kind of stream of the social feed. And I said, it's like, it challenges the listener to like invest time to review the lyrics and then find out the mystery in it. So it's like people actually have to put in the effort in order to figure out your lyrics. I think that's something that's really cool. Interesting. Like, so it gives that idea of someone has to focus to really unbury or dig up kind of the extra meaning, because I feel like when you have a refrain or you have your chorus or you have your repeated line, some of it comes out. And I mean, I feel like that's also like being in a social media feed, right? Sometimes that repetitive nature kind of pops up. And this isn't just this album that you do that. I'm curious, I know that you don't necessarily think of yourself as a lyricist, but how do you think of those vocals functioning within the song?
I actually really like that framing, like the idea that I'm like shadow banning myself. Do you feel like, is it more about the lyrics themselves or is it the execution of like the vocal performance?
Both. I mean, definitely both, because I was going to add to it, and I can say this afterwards too, but one of the things that I feel, even though it is part of the Metaphysics aesthetic, it also functions really well in this album because there's a sense of, even though the music is trying to like push forward and be very present, at the same time there's this like, you either sound lyrically and vocally like you're kind of, can we just slow this down a little bit? Can we just, I want to just say the few things that I need to say, but then like that whole life and internets are flying by you, and it's like there's two kind of interpretations. Like it's also like, oh, everything's just kind of passing you by, but then it's also like, well, I'm just not getting swept up in that wave. That's what it sounds like to me when I listen to it. Is it's kind of this contrast of, you know, the music is just charging on, but then you're like, I'm not going to change. I'm just going to be who I am in the midst of this. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a thought.
No, again, like, I just feel like you kind of hit the nail on the head. I appreciate that because that is kind of how I felt. And it goes back to, again, like how I think maybe initially I was thinking, oh, I'm going to try and do this album with like different friends who are more talented vocally than I am, who might come in and have a cameo moment here and there. But the more I sat with it, the more I felt like, actually, this is how I feel. And it actually is more representative of like the subject matter on the album to put my own voice on it. Even if I feel like there's plenty of songs across the album that I think would probably improve with a different approach. The songs themselves would probably be better, but on the whole, it felt appropriate. I think there's an aesthetic that I appreciate of sort of a subdued vocal, which again, I think we talked last time about. It's kind of a dream pop shoegaze kind of approach to recording vocals. And I think there's something cool about that on its own. But I think in this particular case, it speaks to the alienation or the sort of, I don't know, the feeling, the way I feel when I'm on the internet. Is just this, like it kind of does make me feel like, I don't know, I have lots of things to say, but I'm not trying to like get in your face. You know,
it seems like the algorithms, yes, they are trying to sell you something, but then also like we are the product, we are the information generating, we are almost creating a life outside of ourselves that is going into these databases that are collecting us in a really gross way. And it feeds the AI. It feeds information that is sold to companies. It feeds our echo chamber, like you said before. Right. You know, so basically it just it self-reinforces us in a weird way. But I was kind of curious, midway through this album, there is profit motive, which is, let's just say this one stands out as different. And I almost feel like the sound is, this is a nod to like cyber grind in a little bit. Like there's a little bit, I mean, it doesn't have the blast beats. If you had blast beats, I would totally be like, okay, that's cyber grind. But like, are you actually playing a guitar on that, or is that running it through a synthesizer with some distortion, etc.? Because
so actually, somewhat interestingly, across this entire album, I made a point to specifically limit myself to only synthesizers and plugins on Ableton. So it's like the entire musical landscape is entirely electronic, even when it sounds like it's a guitar.
It certainly speaks to all the things that we see sometimes where it's like, yeah, that's not a real photo, but it looks like a real photo.
And the sort of like, deep fake technology, and that ties into the record too. So that was also an intentional choice. That track, Profit Motive, I also simultaneously kind of wanted to make it sound like a hardcore band, which that is also something across this album that like I wanted to use it as an opportunity to tap into certain musical genres that I'd never tapped into with Metaphysics in the past. And for me, probably the two most prominent examples of that is like, you know, I kind of grew up playing in like hardcore and punk bands and things like that. And I was like, I wanted that to be represented within the Metaphysics universe.
Sure.
So I was like, I wanted to try and do that. And then the other kind of glaring example of that is just electronic, like dance music. I wanted to challenge myself to try to approach both of those genres in my own way with my own limitations and yet kind of just explore them, because these are both like formative scenes for me musically in my musical identity. And so I just wanted to like have my own go at them.
You mentioned Deep Fake, which is actually the next song after that, which you use, or there's the sound of a higher vocal register. Is that a different person, or is that you just pitched up?
It's me pitched up, yeah.
Okay. Because this one also has you pitched down. So there's like these 3 octaves going there. The way that it sounded when I listened is it sounded like you actually recorded 3 separate vocals, pitched one up and pitched one down. Because there's parts where like the consonants or the trails of the end of a phrase, one of the voices is actually a little bit longer than the other. So I kind of, I interpreted that as being a separate vocals, because maybe I'm not great at listening, but when you do that pitch up or pitch down, you lose certain things of being able to differentiate, and it does sound like it's a different voice recording. So I may be wrong, but it sounded like some consonants may have ended at little different spots, so it sounded like a little bit more like multiple people rather than like a pitched, like, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I used that vocal recording technique at other points on the album too, but I did specifically lean into it more so on this song, and it was kind of just meant to be another sort of meta-narrative thing where it's like, well, I'm thinking about how crazy it is that you can deep fake somebody and, you know, post somebody else's likeness on the internet and make it sound like somebody's saying something that they never said, or, you know, and like what sort of ramifications that's going to have in next 10, 20 years is going to be crazy. I just wanted to mimic that by kind of like altering my voice, pitch it up, pitch it down, and kind of play with that as a way of just sort of demonstrating, here's kind of an example of that. And yet at the same time, this is actually still just me alone on the internet, you know? Right.
So we've talked about a few of the songs and, you know, kind of the overall intent, but I'm curious about fitting these songs into a narrative line, or if you wanted it to be a narrative line, or if it was this idea of like kind of jumping around in much the same way as we flip to we're browsing in different web pages, you know. So I was kind of curious about how you decided to put the songs together in a narrative line.
Yeah, I think it felt to me like there's this overarching theme of like trying to make changes for the better and yet still feeling stuck. And then at the same time, I wanted there to be almost like a beginning, middle, and end, or a 3-act structure like you would in a play or something. It is kind of divided up, track 1 through 5, you know, tracks then 6 to 10, and then 11 to 15, so that they all deal with these questions and then end in a place where it's sort of like everything we try to do to make changes, we end up kind of back where we began. You know, 6 to Midnight was the track we talked about last time, and that's pondering this question of like, I don't know, without getting too like pointed, but just sort of like, were we distracted in our own desire for our own well-being, that the forces that be swooped in and undermined our own ability to actually live well, you know? Right. Like, were we too distracted by trying to look out for ourselves that then actually we ended up kind of letting our guard down, and now it's maybe too late for us? There's that sort of like big thematic ending of Act 1, if you will. And then Act 2 also ends with a similar kind of proposition, but it's the song Complex, which is kind of more a meditation on the military industrial complex and the ways that like everything we're doing, you know, it relates to these like social media platforms where it's like, well, some of these CEOs are also invested in like weapons manufacturing. I was just listening to Gia Tolentino being interviewed, and she was talking about the act of social murder that like we sort of implicitly allow, in this case, health insurance companies and health insurance CEOs to literally profit off of, you know, denying people health care, and the ways that we're all implicit in that system. or we all give sort of implicit consent to that system in ways that, like, you know, are seemingly very mundane. Like our own retirement plan might be invested in these companies. So, you know,
right.
Like things of that nature. But then even more so in the case of the military industrial complex, it's like we're literally invested in companies that are dropping bombs on people, you know, and not even just in a military context. Specifically, you know, in Gaza, like 15,000 children have been killed. Those are our own weapons that we are dropping. So
right,
just again, that feeling that like we're stuck no matter what we do. It seems like you might just be trying to collect a paycheck and like save up for your own retirement someday, and something as like, you know, innocent as that is still invested in these systems that are just kind of like built off destruction.
Well, and I also think about, not only are we talking about building weapons, but we're also weaponizing information. The ability to sway the general public to not lose their shit. I mean, to not mount a rebellion or fight against, you know, what's happening in Gaza. Is like there is a certain counterintelligence that is happening with social media, so that people are kind of fed the information that they want to be fed. And what's funny is I think about, as I'm saying that, there's probably some people that may be like, oh, tinfoil hat right there. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, it's like the counterintelligence is to the extent where it tells you that the things that you think are conspiracies cannot be conspiracies because that's a conspiracy theory. And sure. Like, so it's like it works against you in terms of trying to figure out what is really truth. But that's just what was triggered in my head as you said, you know, the military complex. And I was also thinking about that song in terms of, you know, another word of something being complex or something being a military complex, but also an issue psychologically of developing a complex. You know, we think about how we view ourselves, the way that we see ourselves in the world in much that same way of having our own, you know, you've got a complex. One of the things that I enjoy about this piece right here is that, and maybe you do this in the other songs, but this one actually feels like you throw that melody in there with the synthesizers, that you almost play with it and you explore with it a little bit too. Because I feel like you're trying to say some of the same. You use a motif and then you kind of manipulate it a little bit and you change it, and then it kind of explores and it goes. So you end up with kind of an instrumental intermission almost, you know, like you're just giving a little bit of a different story, but through the melody. And I'm not necessarily sure how that fits in that context of this song, but I appreciate the fact that it feels like there's an exploration happening musically. In
Complex, I think you are right. There was definitely a feeling there that I was trying to capture, just a somber tone musically, because I think out of all of the subject matter on this album, that one feels the most glaringly like just like horrible. It just feels like this is like a story as old as time. How heartbreaking it is that like we seemingly want to build a better society and just look out for each other in pretty basic ways. You know, like a lot of the conversations that seem to be happening right now is just sort of like, you know, affordable housing, education, healthcare, you know,
water.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And just that, like, again and again and again, it's like, yeah, but actually, you know, Raytheon, these companies that profit off of weapons manufacturing are the ones who actually end up getting tax breaks. If we would only just flip it around and like give tax breaks to people who are like funding education and actually providing healthcare, actually like providing access to basic living necessities, that, you know, I think everyone is just kind of like really just asking for the bare minimum, you know. And yet our culture just seems so invested in the idea of, I don't know, war profiteering. And the more you double down on that, you know, it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy thing too, where it's like, well, you know, we need to strengthen our military because otherwise we're going to be perceived as weak or something. And so we just keep doubling down, and in the process of doing so, we create more enemies. And then therefore that becomes evidence that we need a stronger military. And so to me, Complex is kind of like really the most heartbreaking song on the album. And so I wanted to try to capture that musically, almost like a funeral, you know?
Right.
I don't know if that came through in the music, but that was kind of what I had in mind.
I could see that, but I was also kind of thinking about the person's inner monologue of kind of sitting with an idea for a while and letting that journey kind of trickle through their brain. I feel like we haven't touched on the songs as much individually, but I also feel like this whole album functions as one piece in itself. It does feel like you do pick a few melodic themes from other pieces and kind of trade them back and forth. I mean, if we're going to talk about Complex, that melody is there, but then it seems like it also shows up in Bend Light. Eye Closer, I almost feel like that almost feels like a schoolyard or a children's melody. Kind of like, I don't know what it is, but the way that it sing-songy, but I feel like that theme drifts into either your bass line theme or the melodic, more lead sounds on your synthesizer will somehow be traded and borrowed into other parts. And I thought that was, it felt like it was intentional, but it could be that you were writing this as, thinking about it as a whole.
Right.
And so you're like, fresh off of this one song, and then you just kind of shared some of that same momentum that you had in creating the others. So just
I think that's really interesting because I can't say that I necessarily planned any of that, but I also think your latter point is probably not far off. Like a lot of these songs were being worked on at the same time, and they all share a similar approach. So the melodic ideas and even things like just like the chord structures that were being used, in some cases, I think I recycled chord progressions. I didn't necessarily like plan to do that, but when I noticed it was happening, I didn't do anything to stop it.
I think you were working with the idea of like a theme album or a concept album, and when that happens, it fits that you do recalls, you do things where it's like, this is now in a new interpretation because it's with these different chords. As a writer myself, I feel like those are those kind of devices that are either foreshadowing or a recall or, kind of flipping the narrative on itself. And I don't know, I think that intentionally or unintentionally, I feel like it's a very effective way to keep the story together.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, this feels like, as I said, it feels like one whole piece. To me, it feels like a whole piece of, following this one person that's kind of dealing with the dystopian existence of technology and social media. I don't know. I guess that's something that stood out to me.
I wanted it to all have a cohesiveness to it. In some cases, I was working on a limited set of instrumentation, somewhat intentionally, which is also like kind of a theme on the record as well in and of itself, in that it's like about kind of making the most with what you have available to you. And that kind of crops up in different moments thematically, lyrically, but even more so wanted to suggest that through the instrumentation that was being used, because I specifically was sort of saying to myself, this is an album about dystopian internet stuff. Let's just make it with the one synthesizer that I own and like whatever sounds I can generate using basically my 10-year-old laptop that has a pirated copy of Ableton on it, which has certain limited plugins available that would all probably crash if I did anything to, try to run an update to my operating system. And in many cases, the computer itself is crashing if I load up too many tracks in the session file. It's like, I can't handle this, and the whole screen would go blank, and then I'd have to reboot the computer. So there was this feeling that like every decision that's being made has to work with this very limited set of instrumentation. And also there's this feeling throughout the album that, this could all fall apart at any minute, which was sort of a narrative on the record, but also a literal reality, while making the album. So I know that this album deals with like a lot of lofty subject matter, and it's tempting to kind of like pose as if you have the answers or something. And for the most part, it just feels like it's necessary to at least try to have the conversation and also make the most with what you have. I think it's probably best to just leave it at that.
Michael, thank you for coming on the show again and telling me about your album Duality, putting it together, the story, and sharing a little bit about yourself and also your creative process. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for listening to Champagne is Also a Band podcast. This is Michael Thies from Metaphysics, reminding you to check out Duality on all streaming platforms now. And don't forget, great music is out there. Go find it where you live.
That's a wrap.
Champagne is also a band.
You almost have an NPR voice. It's so good.
Studio sounds bigger on the inside.
I'm posting this internet about the internet on the internet.